Hi, my name is Lucy, and welcome to Kids Talk Church History, a one-of-a-kind podcast where kids investigate the history of the church. Over 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Has he kept his promise? How has Jesus built and preserved his church against all odds? Come with us on a trip through history to find the answer here on Kids Talk Church History.
Growing up in a small town in southeast Scotland, John Knox could have never imagined that he would play a major role in a powerful movement that transformed his country. From tutor to bodyguard to slave on a French galley, he became involved in some of the most crucial events of Scottish history before he turned 35. After a brief time in England where he served as preacher and pastor, and where he met his wife, he moved to Germany and Geneva, only to be called back to Scotland to inspire a powerful Reformation. Find out what happened next in this episode of Kids Talk Church History. My name is Lucas, and I am 16. I live in San Diego, California.
I'm Emma. I'm also 16, and I live in Raleigh, North Carolina.
I'm Linus. I'm 13, and I live in San Diego, California.
So I've read some on the life of John Knox, and it looks like he hardly had a moment of rest.
He even literally dodged a bullet once.
Yeah, the bullet came through his window and hit the bottom of a candlestick. I've read that a museum in Scotland has the actual candlestick showing the bullet hole.
He must have had a lot of enemies.
Yeah, because he was a major leader of the Reformation that, in Scotland, turned into an actual war.
At the beginning of the 16th century, Scotland was strictly Roman Catholic, so much that if anyone even brought into the country a book by Luther, they would be imprisoned.
Or worse, a man named Patrick Hamilton was burned at the stake in 1528 for teaching that Christians are saved by grace alone through faith alone. And in 1547, John Knox was sent to the galleys for similar reasons when he was a preacher in a castle that the Protestants had taken over.
Can you explain what a galley is?
Well, galleys were ships that were used in times of war. They had sails, but they were also powered by rowers, usually slaves or prisoners like John Knox, who were chained to the galleys and forced to row all day.
Must have been terrible.
Yeah, and if there was a fire or the ship was sinking, no one bothered to unchain the slaves, so they ended up dying.
But by the time Knox went back to Scotland in 1559, things had changed a lot. I've seen a picture of St. Giles Cathedral where he preached around that time. It's very Gothic.
You're right that things changed a lot because there were a lot more Protestants at that time, and they demanded to be free to worship according to their faith. So, as I said earlier, it turned into an actual war.
And the Protestants won.
Yeah, at one point, the King of France, who was Catholic, tried to send some troops to help the Scottish Queen, but some winter storms pushed them back to France. So for a while, there was a compromise where the Queen, Mary Stuart, allowed the Scottish lords, who were almost all Protestant, to form a new parliament.
And that's when 6 different Johns wrote the Scots Confession of Faith.
Yes, 6 men, all named John, including John Knox. I guess they went by their last names, otherwise there would have been a lot of confusion.
Yeah, John has been a very popular name for much of church history, but I know today, even it's still popular. I know about maybe 2 or 3 Johns.
Anyway, let's get back to the Scottish Johns. They also wrote a book of rules for the church.
Yeah, so having a Protestant church was a new thing.
And they encouraged learning. They wanted people to read the Bible, but at that time, only half of the people living in the cities could write their names, let alone read a book. And things were even worse in the country, so they opened schools.
And since most of the adults had to work, kids got a better education than their parents, so they would actually read the Bible to their parents.
Well, there's so much to say about John Knox and the Scottish Reformation, but we need to introduce our guest who has sacrificed his time to tell us more about it. Here we have Dr. Ewen Cameron, who is the Sir William Fraser Professor of Scottish History and Palaeography at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Dr. Cameron, thank you so much for joining our podcast.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
So first question, did I get all those pronunciations right?
Perfect. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And then what is paleography?
Okay, yeah, well, paleography is the study of the interpretation of historic forms of handwriting, not to be confused with paleontology, which, as you know, is the study of dinosaurs.
So you've heard what we've said about John Knox
Yeah.
and the Scottish Reformation. Is there anything you'd like to correct?
No, I don't think so. I think you've obviously done a lot of research and reading, and I've got a good grasp of the outline.
Well, there were so many changes in Scotland from the time when John Knox was born to the time he died. If someone had left Scotland in 1525 and returned 40 years later in 1565, what do you think would have been their reaction?
Yeah, huge difference, I think, at one level, and at another level, a lot of things staying the same, as is often the case in history. So we look back and see the change from the Catholic Church to forms of Protestant worship and church organization by the mid 1660s. And that included huge changes in forms of worship, changes in the way that the Bible and other texts were understood, as you were saying. It also would have seen the destruction of a lot of former ecclesiastical buildings. One thinks of the cathedral at St Andrews, for example, where the town where Knox had been educated, and other church buildings were destroyed in the process of the Reformation. But a lot of things may have actually also stayed the same, because the Reformation, I think, at grassroots level often involved apparent shifts, but things remaining the same. So lots of clergy may just have accommodated themselves with the new regime, but were still the same people that preached before. Knox, of course, himself had begun as a priest in the pre-Reformation church. So lots of things changed, lots of big visible things changed. Sometimes also, maybe we can come back to this, but Scotland's a small place, but very diverse. So whilst probably big changes in the main centres of population, places like Edinburgh, St Andrews, the main centre of sort of political gravity in Scotland in that period was in the towns of the east of Scotland. But if you were to go to the north of Scotland or the southwest of Scotland, probably you would have seen fewer changes. And it's really interesting to look at the different areas of the country and to see how far the Reformation progressed in those areas. So a very different picture, say, in Edinburgh compared to, let's say, parts of the West Highlands. We can maybe come back to that.
So was the change difficult for the Scottish people? Because I know I mentioned a war, so it probably had to be difficult, right?
Yeah, so yes, I mean, I think there were huge changes. If you think of people who had been sincere, devout members of the pre-Reformation church, the shift must have been profound and disturbing for many people in day-to-day activities, forms of worship, how they engaged with their faith must have changed. The other thing to note, I think, is as you were saying in your opening remarks, that there's lots of other things going on that are at once associated with the Reformation, but also slightly separate from it. So there's a huge amount of political strife in Scotland from the 1550s onwards. The Queen abdicates in 1567. You've got an infant monarch, James VI of Scotland, coming to the throne, then being managed by regents, adults who ruled on his behalf. And so lots of other things going on, which also affected the daily lives of people. But on the other hand, lots of things stayed the same, and people's daily lives in agriculture or trading or in fishing communities or whatever people worked probably stayed much the same.
It must also have been odd to have a Roman Catholic queen and a Protestant parliament. Did they work together peacefully?
Well, no, not really. This is one of the key problems, isn't it? Again, as you were saying at the beginning, the Scottish Parliament, which is it ceased to exist in 1707, was an interesting institution because the different, what are known as the different estates, all meet in the same chamber. So we think of the British Parliament today, or your legislature in the United States, where you have two houses, House of Representatives and Senate. We have the House of Commons and the House of Lords in London, and the English Parliament before 1707 was like that. But the Scottish Parliament, all three estates, the clergy, those who represented the boroughs and shires, the towns and counties of Scotland, and the aristocracy, the great lords, they all met in the same house. And Parliament also was, in some senses, quite a weak institution. It could only be called at the behest of the monarch to vote money for the administration of the country. But during the 1560s was one of those periods where the Parliament of Scotland was quite assertive. You see it again in the various points in the 17th century. And there was great strife between the aristocracy, most of whom had converted, not all of them, but most of them had converted to Protestantism. And also in the parliaments of the 1560s, you see lots of minor lairds or minor landowners turning up as representatives of the boroughs and shires. They're exceptionally well attended and politically active parliaments in the 1560s, and the conflict with the Catholic Queen, who was seen as dangerous not only because of her religion but also because of her diplomatic ties with France. As you were saying, it was the Catholic enemy. That was also problematic. So the short answer to your question is no. There was great political strife in Scotland in this period.
Another note on that queen. I read that she didn't have an easy time. She married a man the people disliked, and when her husband got killed, she married the man who was probably his murderer. She was imprisoned, escaped, ran to England, was imprisoned again, and then was executed by Queen Elizabeth for trying to take over the English throne. How did the people in Scotland react to all of this?
Yeah, it's interesting because, again, it becomes a diplomatic conflict and indeed military conflict between Scotland and England. The long history of warfare back and forth across the Scottish border goes back to the late 13th century, even before that, but particularly in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. And again, attempts by the English in the middle of the 16th century to try and assert control over Scotland, rather as Edward's first and second had tried to do in the late 13th, early 14th century. So that was hugely problematic. Mary also becomes a figure, a sort of martyred figure of importance politically and culturally for people who had supported her, and remains an important Catholic martyr, not only in Scotland but right across the world. I was once in Santiago in Chile, and there was a street name named after her, and not because they had any real interest in Scotland, I don't think, but because she was seen as a Catholic martyr and obviously part of the Spanish Empire, and then later as an independent country. And I'm sure you would see that in other Catholic countries today. Her memory survives. So
I've read that the Scottish Protestants organized their church after the model set by John Calvin in Geneva. So how much did they copy from Geneva?
Yeah, in different ways. So the Reformation had two or three effects, I suppose, on the way in which people organized their religion. They firstly in theology, increasing use of vernacular languages, so English, and Gaelic, the language of the northwest of Scotland, was used in worship as opposed to Latin masses. Much less formula, slightly freer forms of worship. And then also in terms of church organization, they used the Presbyterian system, which is a kind of bottom-up system of church courts. We don't have bishops or archbishops in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, or the Kirk as it's known. You have different courts at different levels. You have a thing called the Kirk Session, which is the lowest court. Then the Presbytery, which is groups of Kirk sessions coming together, working all the way up until you reach the ultimate court of the Church of Scotland, which is called the General Assembly. And that meets every May here in Edinburgh. It has met in other places throughout its history. So there's this Presbyterian set of layers, if you like, of church courts which work their way up. So all of these things were drawn, and also Calvinist theology. I mean, obviously you have different patterns of Reformation across Europe, but in Scotland, theologically, the church followed a Calvinist route rather than a Lutheran route. So Calvinist theology based on ideas of predestination, for example, remains very important in some churches in 20th century Scotland, well, 21st century Scotland, contemporary Scotland. So yes, they did follow theological ideas, and what are called ecclesiological ideas, i.e., it's a long word, isn't it? Sorry to force that on you, but ecclesiology is the form of government and the study of the form of government. So in both those senses, they drew on European influences.
I didn't send you this question ahead of time, but as you were talking about Geneva, I am curious as to how much of the psalmody from Geneva influenced Scottish psalmody, which I know in my denomination that has been a huge influence. So would you mind talking a little bit about the Scottish psalmody?
Yeah, the Scottish psalmody, it's interesting. It's very important. I mean, obviously, much of the form of worship in Scotland, until quite recently, until within my lifetime, has been based on the King James version, the authorized version of the Bible from the early 17th century. So the Scottish psalmody is based on that, the metrical psalms, and these were the only forms of sung praise that were used in most Presbyterian churches until the 19th century. I mean, there are still some Presbyterian churches in Scotland, the Free Church of Scotland and the Free Presbyterian Church and other smaller Presbyterian churches who still only have praise with unaccompanied singing, and church music in the Presbyterian tradition is really an innovation of the 19th century, when musical instruments like organs began to be installed in Presbyterian churches, and hymns, drawing on the Baptist and Methodist, particularly the Methodist tradition. So Wesleyan hymns from England in the 18th century were increasingly used, and then lots of Victorian, and then the new hymns get sung, and the Church of Scotland today is very open in its forms of sung praise, but it wasn't always the case, and it was very much based on a psalmody, which of course was both the psalms and paraphrases of biblical passages, mostly Old Testament biblical passages that stem from the 17th century.
Thank you. So John Knox had a pretty bad reputation with some queens because of a paper that he wrote called The Monstrous Regiment of Women. The first time I heard this title, well, I always kind of think of it as like, I don't know, a parade of like women that he doesn't like. But so regiment means rule, right? And did he think that women shouldn't rule a country? What was his thing about?
Well, yes, more or less. He disagreed with Calvin about this, who had a much more moderate position, as far as I understand it. But of course, Knox was influenced by his distaste for particular women, principally Mary, Queen of Scots, and also to a degree the English Queen Mary as well, who tried to reassert Catholicism south of the border. So his blast, if you like, his polemic was directed against those women particularly, but I do think it also extended to a general dislike, or not a dislike, a general feeling that rule by women was not a legitimate form of government. Another long word, or an obscure word, you may not have heard of the word of gynarchy, Gynarchy, gynarchy. So this is the idea of rule by women, which Knox didn't like, and he was possibly influenced by Calvin. I think he had planned further pamphlets on the question, but didn't in fact proceed to write or publish those.
So after Mary, her son James became King of Scotland as James I. This is the James that commissioned the King James Bible, which you mentioned earlier. So how did his rule affect both countries and how did it affect the Scottish Reformation?
Yeah, it's interesting. So James becomes, so Mary, Queen of Scots' son, James VI, becomes James VI of Scotland in 1567. And then in 1603, on the death of Queen Elizabeth, the first of England, who died without issue, he, as the closest heir, becomes the so-called Union of the Crowns, becomes king of both Scotland and England, and he becomes James VI of Scotland, James I of Britain, if you like. So this is England, Wales, and Scotland. Quite quickly, in the early 1600s, the first 10 or so years of his reign, he sought to try and pull the two countries even closer together. So the Union of the Crowns, Scotland still had a parliament, it still had its own church, its own established church, it still had its own legal system, its own education system, but he did seek to bring the two countries together. But English politicians weren't very keen on the idea of having what they saw as a rather poverty-stricken country in the north join up. So his ambitions were frustrated. Both he and his son, Charles I, I think, were regarded with a degree of suspicion. Charles I, particularly, a degree of suspicion. They were seen as religious innovators. Charles I, especially, and in the so Charles I comes on the throne in 1625, and they and the innovations that he tries to introduce in the Scottish Church eventually leads to conflict. Again, both within Scotland and between Scotland and England, the so-called War of the Three Kingdoms. The English Civil War is part of that. So these are innovations within a post-reformed religious culture, rather than trying to, induce a counter-reformation. But they were still very controversial.
Do you have a favorite story about John Knox's life?
Well, it's interesting because Knox, we don't know a huge amount about Knox, actually, and lots of the stories we hear about him are probably romantic myths that are developed in the 18th, 19th centuries. But my story, I think, is I've read when he was a galley slave, as you were talking, in the late 1540s, the galley that he was serving on came back into the Firth of Tay, which is the body of water to the north of Fife, so between St Andrews and Dundee on the east coast of Scotland. And he could see, it said that he could see the spires of the town of St Andrews, where he had been educated at the university there, and also had preached there, and that this was was quite a profound and poignant moment for him at a time of great suffering, as you said yourself at the beginning, Lucas.
So we've been learning a lot about Reformations in different countries. So what would you say is unique about the Scottish Reformation?
Yeah, it's a good question, I think. I think that the traditional view of the Scottish Reformation is that it was rather a bottom-up movement. Not everybody agrees with that point of view, but I think if you were going to argue that there was something unique about what happened here in Scotland, you would make that point, that it wasn't imposed from above for diplomatic reasons, as perhaps in England, but it was driven from below. I think that point can be exaggerated. It's also worth noting that the Reformation was very uneven across Scotland. There are areas of Scotland in the northeast of Scotland, so to the north of Aberdeen, in the West Highlands, particularly the islands, some of the southern end of the Hebridean Islands, where the Reformation didn't reach, largely because of geography, sometimes because the landowners remained Catholic. And today, if you go to islands like South Uist and Barra, the very large proportion of the population is Catholic. They worship in Catholic churches. There are roadside shrines and forms of Catholic devotion, and that remains powerful today. So Scotland, I think, you could argue perhaps is this bottom-up Reformation, but also has a rather uneven effect of the Reformation and continuing Catholicism. Catholicism in Scotland receives a great boost, of course, in the 19th century, when many hundreds of thousands of people from Ireland moved to Scotland, and you see a revival of the Catholic Church in Scotland in that period.
Thank you so much. So real quick, we have two questions that we like to ask all our guests. So First, how did you become interested in church history?
Yeah, well, I was brought up in the Church of Scotland, and then when I studied, I began to get interested in Scottish history when I was a student. Began to get interested in an event in the 19th century called the disruption of the Church of Scotland. So this is when the church divides over. Basically who gets to appoint ministers, whether it should be the landowners, the crown, town councils on the one hand, or the people of the kirk on the other hand. So there was a great dispute. The disruption occurred in 1843, and a new church called the Free Church of Scotland, also Presbyterian, was created. And my mother actually grew up in that church. She grew up in the Isle of Skye, and the Free Church is very powerful in other parts of the Hebrides. So I was interested in that movement, and you can't really understand what was going on at the disruption without understanding those debates and conflicts engaged in by the Covenanters in the 17th century, or indeed by the Reformers in the 16th century, because both parties in the disruption appealed to the history of Presbyterian conflict. So that's really how I got interested.
Awesome. So if you could meet anyone from the Scottish Reformation or the Reformation in general, who would that be?
It's really an interesting question. I think I would obviously Knox would be amazing to meet, but Jean Calvin would, I think, be very interesting to meet, because of course, I mean, Knox I don't think was a great theologian. He was a very powerful and influential figure, but I think as an academic, as somebody who is interested in ideas, and Calvinist ideas have been such of such importance in theology in Scotland, and so influential in the universities. For example, the university which I teach in Edinburgh is a post-Reformation institution. It was formed in 1582-83. So yeah, I think Jean Calvin would be a very interesting man to meet.
Well, Dr. Cameron, we are so thankful that you decided to spend this time with us. And listeners, if you visit our website, kidstalkchurchhistory.org, you'll find a link where you can enter a drawing for a free book. This time, we are giving away Simonetta Carr's book, John Knox, where you can find a lot more about this adventurous reformer. And while you're there, we want to let you know that we're bringing back a special offer we had some months ago. Just fill out the form on our website with your name and your favorite episode of the series of this Reformation, and you will be entered in a drawing for the opportunity to be with us by Zoom in a special upcoming episode. We are looking forward to having you with us so right soon. In partnership with the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, and on behalf of my co-hosts, Grace and Linus, my name is Lucas. Thank you very much for listening to Kids Talk Church History.